Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. We're here to, as always, get you up to speed on a complex topic really quickly without, all the fluff. And today we are taking a look at how education can actually be personalized for individual students. And to do that, we are diving into a research article, which is really going to help us get there.
Yeah, we're looking at developing personalized education, a dynamic framework by Tetzlaff, Schmiedek, and Broad. It was published in Educational Psychology Review back in September 2021. So this is a really comprehensive look at what it takes to tailor learning to every student.
Yeah.
We're going to sort of pick out the gems, what works, what doesn't, and hopefully give you a really clear picture of personalized education.
Yeah, and what struck me right off the bat is that this isn't just some theoretical, thought experiment. They've looked at personalization in action across many learning environments, like, labs, classrooms, and digital platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the key findings right away, just jumps out at you. Personalized education works best when you're constantly keeping track of the learner's, important characteristics, and then, using that up-to-date information to adjust the instruction in a systematic way.
So kind of a continuous feedback loop, always learning more about the student.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. How does this article define personalized education? What's at the core of it?
Well, they define it as using data to adjust any aspect of instruction, really, to fit the unique needs of a specific learner.
Makes sense. So instead of this one-size-fits-all approach, it's really about tailoring, everything to the individual.
Right.
Now, the article also talks about some related terms that sound kind of similar but have slightly different shades of meaning, like adaptive, personalization, individualization, and differentiation. Could you quickly clarify those for us?
Yeah, so adaptive is like the big umbrella term. It covers any approach where the instruction changes based on what we know about the learner.
Okay, broad category.
Right. And then personalization and individualization are basically used synonymously in the article. They both mean tailoring instruction for a specific student, usually based on some assessment or model of that student.
So getting really granular one-on-one.
Exactly. And then there's differentiation, which is more about adjusting instruction for groups of learners in a classroom, not necessarily down to the individual level.
Okay, so different levels of tailoring. Now, when you actually want to put personalized education into practice, they talk about this general personalization loop in the article. What are the key steps involved?
Yeah, they have this loop shown in Figure 1, and it starts with assessing the learner's characteristics, basically building a student model, a representation of what the learner knows and how they learn.
Right, so first you got to understand who you're teaching.
Exactly. And then step 2 is instructional design. You use that student model to design the next unit of learning, making sure it's the right next step for that student towards their overall learning goal.
So based on that assessment, you create the right learning experience.
Right. And then the third step is, continually assessing their progress. As the learner works through the instruction, you gather data, whether it's through their task performance or, quizzes or whatever.
Always checking in, making sure it's working.
Exactly. And then that new data feeds back into updating the student model. So it's this loop of assess, instruct, assess, and constantly refining your understanding of the learner and the instruction.
It's like a continuous improvement cycle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, now the article also briefly mentions learner-driven personalization, giving learners more control over their own learning. What's the research say about that?
Well, that's a really interesting idea, right? Learners know themselves best, so give them control.
Yeah.
And it's becoming more common in different settings. But research on metacognition, which is basically our ability to understand our own learning processes, suggests that, learners aren't always the best judges of what they need.
So just giving them free rein might not be the best idea.
Yeah. There's research showing that students might actually choose easier tasks or, stuff they already know well, instead of focusing on areas where they need to grow.
So it's not just about giving control, but also about making sure that control is used effectively.
Exactly. The amount of control a learner needs probably depends on their prior knowledge and the learning goals.
It's not a simple equation. Okay, now the article then delves into this history of research on personalized learning and focuses on this concept called aptitude treatment interactions, or ATIs. What's the basic idea behind those?
Yeah, so ATIs were like the main framework for thinking about personalization for a long time. The idea is that you try to match the learner's aptitudes, their natural talents or, existing characteristics with the best instructional methods for them.
So if you know what someone's good at, you teach them in a way that aligns with that.
Yeah, like, for example, someone with strong visual skills, you might give them more visual learning materials.
Makes sense. But the article suggests that the research on ATIs hasn't been uh, super conclusive.
Yeah, that's a big point. Despite tons of research, the findings on ATIs have been pretty inconsistent. There was this major review back in '77 that basically said there weren't many clearly established aptitude by treatment interactions that we could use confidently.
So decades of research, not a lot of clear answers. Why is that?
Well, there are probably a few reasons. A lot of the early research was done in labs, which might not reflect real classrooms. The measures they used to assess aptitude were often complex, and sometimes the different teaching methods they were comparing weren't actually that different in important ways. Plus, there were some statistical issues in how the data was analyzed.
So a mix of methodological challenges, maybe. But does this mean the whole idea of ATIs is wrong?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, the basic idea that different learners might learn better with different approaches still seems pretty valid. And the fact that some personalized learning programs do show positive results suggests that there might be some underlying ATIs at play.
So we might just not have figured out how to consistently identify and use them effectively.
Exactly.
And then they bring up this expertise reversal effect. What's that about?
The expertise reversal effect is kind of like a specific example of an ATI. It's this thing where a teaching method that's really helpful for beginners can actually hinder more experienced learners.
So what works at one level might not work at another.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that highlights, how learners are always changing and what they need changes too.
Right. So a static approach, just looking at one point in time, might not be enough.
Yeah, that's the main takeaway. Learning is dynamic, learners change, and we need to take that into account.
So now let's move on to how personalization has been used in digital learning environments. The article mentions a couple of common approaches.
Right. One very popular approach is adapting content based on the learner's supposed learning style. Visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and so on.
Yeah, like if you're a visual learner, you get more videos and images. But the article doesn't seem very convinced by that, does it?
Yeah, it's pretty skeptical. The research supporting learning styles is actually really weak, and more importantly, meta-analyses, which combine data from multiple studies, haven't found any clear benefits of teaching to learning styles compared to just providing good instruction to everyone.
That's surprising given how popular that idea is. So what are some of the digital approaches that seem to be working better?
Well, the article points to intelligent tutoring systems, or EYES, as a much more promising approach. EYES are basically computer programs that aim to provide personalized instruction by, building a model of the learner's knowledge and skills.
So they go beyond just like adjusting task difficulty based on past performance.
Exactly. They're more dynamic. And two key features stand out. First, they do student modeling, which means they're constantly assessing the learner's knowledge and skills as they interact with the system.
So building a more detailed, ongoing picture of the student.
Right. And then second, they actually adapt the instruction based on this evolving student model.
So they're not just delivering preset content, but responding to the student's progress in real time.
Yeah, and there's good evidence that EYES can be really effective. There have been meta-analyses showing improvements in student learning across different subjects.
And they can adapt to more than just academic knowledge, right?
Yeah, some ITECs have been shown to successfully adapt to things like a learner's metacognitive skills, their emotional state, their motivation, and provide tailored support in those areas too.
It's like they're responding to the whole learner, not just their test scores.
Exactly. That dynamic assessment and adaptation seem to be key.
Okay, now let's switch gears and talk about personalized learning in traditional classrooms. How do teachers try to personalize learning in that setting?
Well, one common approach is ability grouping, where you put students into groups based on their academic abilities, either for certain subjects or even for the whole school day.
And what does the research say about that?
The results are mixed. Some studies show small benefits, especially for high-achieving students, but overall, the effects aren't super strong. There's some evidence that more individualized models, where instruction is truly tailored to each student within the classroom, can have a bigger impact.
Makes sense. The more individualized, the better, probably. Now, what about the most common way that teachers try to personalize learning in their classrooms?
The article highlights formative assessment as the most widespread systematic approach.
And what is formative assessment exactly?
It's basically the process of using evidence of student learning gathered by the teacher, the learners themselves, or their peers to make decisions about the next steps in instruction.
So it's about ongoing feedback and adjustment, not just waiting for the final test.
Right. And the roots of this idea actually go back to special education and the concepts of mastery learning, where you want to make sure students master a topic before moving on.
So formative assessment is like building on that and making it a regular part of the classroom.
Exactly. And there's a lot of research showing that formative assessment can have a really positive effect on student learning.
So even in the busy environment of a classroom, taking the time to check in with students and adjust instruction seems to make a big difference.
Yeah, the success of formative assessment really highlights the power of a dynamic modeling. Using these repeated measurements of learning progress to inform teaching. And the article even suggests that we could use that idea to track other learner characteristics, not just academic knowledge.
So this idea of dynamic modeling seems to be a recurring theme. Could you break that down a bit more? What exactly is it, and why is it so important for personalized education?
Yeah, so dynamic modeling is basically recognizing that learning isn't a static event, it's a process. Learners change over time. And it's about constantly gathering information and updating our understanding of the learner as they go through the instruction.
So not relying on a one-time assessment, but constantly adjusting our view of the student.
Exactly. And that's why static approaches, like just trying to match fixed aptitudes to teaching methods, haven't always worked so well.
And it's also why more dynamic approaches like ITS and a formative assessment seem to be more promising.
Right. The key is to recognize that learners are dynamic.
Okay, so when we talk about a student model, what exactly are we talking about?
A student model is basically any representation of a learner that a teacher or a system uses to make decisions. It could be a formal model in an ITS, or it could be a teacher's mental model of a student.
Like their understanding of the student's strengths and weaknesses.
Right. The important distinction is between static models, which are based on a one-time assessment, and dynamic models, which are always being updated.
And what are the problems with those static models?
Well, they can lead to mismatches between the instruction and the learner's actual needs as they progress. They might not capture how a learner develops new skills or how their preferences change. And they can even lead to situations where you're giving too much help, which actually prevents learners from developing certain skills.
It's like you're trying to navigate with an outdated map.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea of dynamic modeling isn't completely new. Researchers have been using it in different ways, like in developmental psychology and educational research, to understand how learners change during the learning process.
So it's about recognizing that learners are constantly evolving, not fixed entities.
Right. And then the article goes on to introduce this concept of learner dynamics.
What does that mean?
It means that the characteristics of learners actually vary in three main ways, and these are happening on different timescales.
Okay, so different kinds of change happening at different speeds.
Exactly. First, there's the macro scale, which refers to changes happening over months or years, mostly driven by developmental processes.
So the long-term changes.
Right. Then there's the mesoscale, which is changes over days or weeks, mainly driven by instruction or specific interventions.
So how the learner responds to the teaching.
Yeah. And then there's the microscale, which is super short-term fluctuations happening within minutes or hours.
Like moment-to-moment changes in their state.
Exactly. And they have this really helpful figure, figure 2, which shows how these three timescales interact.
It's like layers of change happening simultaneously. Okay, so let's unpack each time scale a bit more. Starting with the macro scale, the long-term changes. What drives those?
Well, those are mainly driven by developmental processes, things like brain maturation, the environment, and of course, just the accumulation of knowledge and skills over time. And these developmental trajectories can be different for different learners, and even for different abilities within the same learner.
So not everyone develops at the same pace or in the same way.
Right. Like, for example, working memory capacity, which is how much information you can hold in your mind at once, tends to increase a lot during childhood and adolescence. But some aspects of motivation and personality might be more stable over time, although they can still fluctuate in the short term.
So different characteristics evolve differently.
Exactly. And this macro scale is really relevant to how we structure education, like the whole grade-based system. We group students by age and assume they're at a similar developmental level. And even in digital learning platforms, you often have these preset learning paths designed for longer-term goals.
So we're already kind of implicitly working with this idea of developmental trajectories.
Yeah. And there's actually research showing that the effectiveness of some teaching methods can depend on the age and developmental stage of the learner.
Makes sense. Okay, now let's move to the mesoscale. Those changes happening over days or months. What's the main driver there?
At this level, it's mainly the instruction itself, the interventions, the learning activities. Every lesson, every unit can be seen as an intervention aimed at changing the learner's knowledge and skills. But it's not just about knowledge. Other characteristics, like learning strategies, can also be influenced over this timescale.
So we can actually shape those characteristics through targeted instruction.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where adapting the difficulty of the material based on the learner's progress is super important.
So making sure it's challenging enough, but not too hard.
Right. If a student is struggling, they might need some extra support on the foundational knowledge before they can move on. Informative assessment is really crucial here because it provides the data to make those decisions about the next steps.
It's like that continuous feedback loop we talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and finally, the microscale, the really short-term changes. What causes those?
Those are often driven by things like the learner's emotional state, their mood, their frustration level, even just moment-to-moment variations in their cognitive resources, like attention or working memory.
So how they're feeling at that particular moment can really impact their learning.
Absolutely. And this is really important in the classroom, creating that supportive and positive environment because a student's emotional state can really affect their engagement and performance. And there's even research looking at using technology to automatically detect a learner's emotional state and adjust the instruction accordingly.
That's pretty cool. And how do ICES address these microscale changes?
Some ITS are designed to be very sensitive to these short-term fluctuations. They might use eye tracking to see if a student is getting bored or confused and then adjust the content. Or they might offer help if they detect that the student is struggling or getting frustrated.
So it's like providing support at just the right moment, not just based on their overall knowledge level.
Exactly.
Okay, so this dynamic framework, looking at all three of these timescales, really gives us a much richer understanding of how to approach personalized education.
Yeah, exactly. And the article actually presents this framework visually in Figure 3.
So it takes all this complexity and makes it a bit easier to grasp.
Right, and it emphasizes that you need that initial assessment to understand the learner's starting point, but then you have to keep gathering data at all three timescales to inform the instruction.
It's like a journey where you have to keep adjusting the course based on the terrain and the weather.
Yeah, it's a good analogy.
So let's quickly go back to each timescale and see how this framework guides action. At the macro scale, what are the main things to focus on?
At that level, it's about setting those long-term learning goals, making sure they're appropriate for the learner's developmental stage and their initial skills. And then you have to track their progress and maybe adjust those goals if they're not progressing as expected.
So the big picture stuff.
Yeah.
And then at the mesoscale.
Where it's about designing the individual units of instruction, making sure they're challenging enough, but also within the learner's reach based on their current knowledge and skills. Formative assessment plays a big role in deciding if they're ready to move on or need more support.
So making sure each step of the journey is the right size.
Exactly.
And finally, at the microscale.
It's about providing that just-in-time support, the feedback, the hints, the encouragement, based on what you're seeing from the learner at that moment. And the key is to find that balance between providing enough support, but not so much that they become dependent on it.
It's like being a good coach, knowing when to step in and when to let them figure it out on their own.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
Okay, so this framework really gives us a roadmap for how to think about personalized education in a more complete and dynamic way.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond those static assessments and embracing the fact that learning is a process of change.
It's about seeing learners as constantly evolving, not as having these fixed traits. What are some of the benefits of adopting this dynamic view?
Well, by constantly tracking learners, we get a much more accurate picture of their abilities and how they develop. We can understand their individual learning curves better, see when they're struggling or excelling, and even get insights into how different factors interact within a learner to influence their progress.
So it's not just about measuring where they are now, but understanding how they got there and where they're going.
Right, and the article actually compares this to how patient care is evolving in clinical psychology. They're using these dynamic models to tailor treatments and adjust them based on how the patient responds.
So it's like personalized medicine for education.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Now, obviously, this dynamic approach puts more demands on teachers and on the whole educational system.
Yeah, it definitely does. But the framework helps to manage that complexity by breaking it down into these different timescales.
So focusing on the most important things at each level.
Right. And the article highlights that there's still a lot of research to be done. We need to better understand which interventions work best for different learners and at what points in their learning.
So we're still figuring out the details.
Yeah, but the big picture is that we need to move towards this more dynamic and personalized approach to education.
Well, this has been a really fascinating dive into the dynamic framework of personalized education. I think it gives us a whole new way to think about how we can tailor learning to the individual.
I agree. And it leaves us with this thought. Think about those 3 timescales of learning in your own life. Not just in formal education, but in anything you're trying to learn. Are you focusing too much on just one timescale? What might you gain by paying attention to the longer-term trends, the immediate responses to your efforts, and even those short-term fluctuations in your motivation and focus?
It's about understanding that learning is a dynamic process, and we need to be dynamic learners.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.